Soon after John left Britain, we moved house again. Roberto's non-stop partying had continued and the bills were running up. I could no longer afford to spend whatever I wanted, and I was keenly aware that what money I had must last until Julian grew up. I made a vain bid to persuade Roberto to forgo his visits to restaurants and nightclubs. I sold the house in Kensington and we moved to Wimbledon. It meant another new school for Julian, but I hoped that a more settled family lifestyle would make up for that. I was now just an ordinary mum, doing the school run and shopping in the local supermarket, and I liked it. Nothing could have compared with the life I'd had with John, and I didn't want to try to recreate it. I preferred to be back in the normal world. Most people I met had no idea who I was. I had been in the background for a lot of the time when I was with John, and when I did appear in public, it had been at his side. So without him, people couldn't place me. And who would expect to meet a Beatles ex-wife at the checkout in Sainsbury's? Of course I still had celebrity friends and went to exciting parties with Roberto, but I kept that part of my life separate from the everyday world I lived in, and even the parents of Julian's school friends, who brought their children to tea, seldom commented on who we were. Wimbledon was pleasant, but I had no ties there, and life with Roberto was trying. Far from cutting back on his partying, he had opened a taxi account and was running up even more bills by taking taxis into the West End every evening. He still worked at the restaurant his father had bought, Da Bassano, but every night he filled it with his friends and let them eat without paying. He loved to be loved, and the price of his popularity was our financial burden. Roberto had always been spoiled by his parents and had never had to deal with the harsh realities of life. His playfulness was a delight that became too much for me to handle. I didn't want to party all the time when I was spending hours each month poring over the accounts and lying awake worrying. Begging, pleading, and demanding had little effect on him. He would make promises he didn't mean, then tell me how much he loved me, buying me roses and looking at me with puppy dog eyes until I had to see the funny side. But by 1973, I knew I couldn't stay in the marriage. The only thing that had stopped me walking out sooner was Julian. I felt terrible to be taking him away from someone who was now so important to him. Roberto had done so much to fill the gap that John had left in Julian's life. But I had to. I was no longer willing to live with someone who wouldn't grow up, take a job, or share responsibilities with me. So with a heavy heart, I told Roberto I wanted us to separate. There were many tears from the three of us, and it took all my determination to see it through. My only comfort was that Roberto, even though he was deeply hurt when I left him, never deserted Julian, most unusually for a step-parent, and particularly after such a short marriage. He kept in touch and regularly invited him to Italy, where in later years Roberto began, ironically, to make a lot of money. In 1974, after my divorce from Roberto, Julian and I headed north. I bought a bungalow in Mells, a village in the Wirral, close to Hoylake. It was good to be home again. I was now just down the road from Mum, and it was lovely to be able to see her as often as I liked. I enrolled Julian at Kingsmead School, which was close to home. I was conscious that this was his 5th school, and he was not yet 11, an awful lot of change for any child to cope with. But he was happy there, and immediately made a lifelong friend in Justin Clayton. Our bungalow, Rosebank, was very ordinary, and I was aware that it was a stopgap, somewhere safe to take stock of 2 broken marriages and decide what I wanted for the future. I was on my own for the first time since I was 18 and felt very low. I knew I could easily fall apart, but I realized I couldn't afford to do that. I had a son to care for. While I was picking up the pieces after my second marriage, I was stunned to read in the papers of a major development in John's life. He and Yoka had parted. Apparently they had agreed on a trial separation, late in 1973, and John had moved to Los Angeles with Mei Pang, a young Chinese employee. What might this mean for Julian? Would John be willing now to have contact with me and see his son? I wondered about getting in touch with him or whether I should just wait and see. I decided for the moment to wait. It seemed that John was going through a strange phase. Over the next few months he hit the headlines several times for being drunk and brawling. But he was also creative for the first time in ages, working on a new album and getting together with other musicians, including friends like singer Harry Nilsson and Ringo, to record an album of his favourite songs by other musicians. I hoped that this would prove the start of a more positive period in his life, that might include his son. But would he get in touch, or should I contact him? In the summer of 1974, I phoned Peter Brown, got John's number and rang him. He was surprised to hear from me, but not as surprised as I was to get through to him on the first try, after so many years of non-communication. Our conversation was awkward and neither of us wanted to make small talk, so I got straight to the point and said I'd like to bring Julian over to see him. John sounded pleased with the idea and agreed. I told him I had no money, so he said he'd pay for first-class tickets for us. I was thrilled. A few days later we sailed from Southampton. Julian was excited at the thought of seeing his dad, but nervous too. He was a bright, lovable, but shy 11-year-old, and I hoped that John would be proud of him. I knew that after 3 years they would have a lot to learn about each other, and I prayed that they would get on. When the ship docked, John was waiting for us, with May beside him. It was both wonderful and painful to see him again. He was pale and gaunt and clearly nervous. He pecked me on the cheek, then scooped Julian into his arms and hugged him. Then we were introduced to May, a sweet but slightly lost-looking girl of 23. We were ushered into the limousine where Julian sat between John and May, and I was on the seat behind them. John chatted exclusively to Julian, leaving me an awkward, silent passenger. John did tell me that he, May and Julian were flying to Los Angeles the next morning, that I could go with them and stay with friends of his, drummer Jim Keltner and his wife, Another Sin.